Good afternoon. Thank you for bearing with us amid all this heat. So, if this latest talk looks like a retrospective, I should hasten to point out that Martin Tomkinson is still an active working investigative journalist and CIJ trainer with plenty of puff left in him. In a career spanning 5 decades, he has written for all the UK's major newspapers. He started work with Private Eye in 1972, and since 1981 he's been a freelancer. So he was a financial researcher on the Mail on Sunday's Rich List. He's worked on the Sunday Times' Rich List. He's also the author of 2 books, Nothing to Declare with Michael Gillard, and the Porn Brokers, The Rise of the Soho Sex Barons, which still gets lots of interest among documentary makers. There's another reason why this talk isn't a retrospective. Rather than dwell on Martin's vast experience over 5 decades, we thought we'd use it this time as a springboard to think about the rules you need to follow to be good at it, investigative journalism, that is, and to invite you into a conversation about the same and how you think things might be changing. So, okay, Martin, over to you. Let's lay out some of these rules one by one. I think you have 4 of them, perhaps with some examples. So give us rule 1.
Good afternoon. Right. Good afternoon. It's a bit of a misnomer. I was forced to put a certain number on this. There may be 6, there may be 5, there may be 7. But let's start at the beginning with the absolute necessities. And the first is look after your contacts. First of all, gain contacts, because
Closer to you. Closer to you.
Oh. Yeah. Because the difference between one journalist and another journalist is what we used to call the little black book, i.e. their black book of contacts. Because in a competitive world, which Fleet Street used to be, somebody who had good contacts, they didn't necessarily have to be in the Prime Minister's office or anything like that, but when a subject came up, people would say, the editor or news editor would say, who knows anything about this? The more and the better the contacts you have, the better chances you have of progressing as a journalist. And a journalist, not necessarily an investigative journalist, but any journalist. But this comes with a responsibility, and that responsibility is you never, ever, ever, even under the thumbscrews, divulge your source. It's an age-old journalistic, almost cliche, and it is sometimes being observed in dishonestly, but it is the case. Because if you get the reputation of not protecting your sources will effectively dry up. They won't trust you. And very often it takes a long time to get the trust of a really good contact. And what your reputation is what you actually get paid for. And I will give you an example of that in a moment. But it is absolutely vital that you do not, even to your own editor or your own lawyers, you do not reveal your sources, because that way lies ruin. Allied to that, and almost as important, is that if you're an investigative journalist, it's not 100% the case with just a general journalist, but certainly if you're an investigative journalist, it's necessary that when you're researching a story, you check, check, check again. It sounds like rather like a sort of old granny telling you what to do, how to cross the road or what have you. But if you're dealing with financial issues, it's very, very simple to make elementary mistakes. Now, for the last 20 years, 20 odd years, I have given a talk at Goldsmiths about the uses of Companies House. Companies House, for those of you who don't know, is the repository of all the limited companies in the UK or who have offices in the UK. There are something like 6 million of these. So the chances of there being two people with the same name are very high. And beware of the brain's bias, because psychologists and psychiatrists have studied the brain, and it is a proven fact that when you're looking for something, your brain automatically is trying to find it. And if it finds something it's a bit like a search engine. If it finds something very similar to it, you can be fooled, because it can be, say you were looking for James Harkin. You might come across a James Harkin with a G on the end, and it might be a near enough date of birth, and you're very tired because being looking at it all day long, you might make the mistake. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Because you will, if the information is wrong, you will cost your own reputation and very possibly a large sum of money to your organization. And I will give you two horrible examples. One was, and this goes right to the heart of it in a way, because this mistake was made by our fellow investigative journalism organizations, the Bureau. And the person, I won't mention his name, but the person who was the director at the time made a mistake in that very difficult area of historic child abuse. And in essence, a number of witnesses, one in particular, had made allegations against eminent people to the BBC and to the Bureau. And one of the people involved was a man called McAlpine. Lord McAlpine was an ex-treasurer of the Conservative Party, an eminent politician, close friend of Margaret Thatcher, etc., etc., etc. Both the BBC and the Bureau made the mistake of identifying him as a person who had regularly visited a boys' home just outside Wrexham in North Wales and abused young boys and young men. The problem with it is it was completely wrong. It was a different McAlpine. The BBC had to apologize, and I think maybe a couple of people had to resign, and the director of the Bureau also had to resign. Simply and solely, and it's more difficult when you're dealing with people's personal recollections, as it were. But a more straightforward example is an example from Companies House itself. Now, those of you who use Companies House will know that the very first letters underneath the logo are Companies House makes no, does not pretend to verify any of this information. So all we do at Companies House is we're acting like a giant photocopier. The responsibility for the accuracy of the figures is the company's alone. And this leads, I mean, this does lead to complete farces, because people would send in names of ridiculous names of companies, like Mac the Knife Limited and things like that. Nobody's checking at that stage, they weren't. And so all sorts of errors can exist. But in this occasion, it was Company House's fault. Some tired or whatever clerk had put the name of a company as being in liquidation, i.e. it was having to sell, it was having to liquidate, get rid of all its assets, and it was going to go bust. The name of the company was one letter wrong. They were sued by the company that they'd mentioned, who claimed that they'd lost tens of thousands of pounds and a lot of reputation by this mistake. And Company's House was fined £800,000. So the very registry of company details had been fined for making a mistake. So you cannot afford to make mistakes. Now, I don't know how many of you were here this morning and listening to Joshi Herman's excellent presentation about his company, Mill Media, where he said at one stage, right at the beginning, that his experience was that readers wanted stories more than facts. And I'm very uneasy with that, because I came into journalism and learned my abilities and skills with people who took the opposite view, who took the view that the facts are prime. And it really depends, but you have to be very careful if what you're trying to do is more along the lines of a story than in fact to give the facts. Because if you put the facts down, and there's an overriding thing here, which I learned at Private Eye, where my editor, Richard Ingrams, would remove most of the adjectives of my initial copy. What you're doing is you should really, if your copy's any good, the facts should speak for themselves. So you don't say, here are the facts, this proves that they are murdering, lying bastards. You never would do that, but you don't comment on it, because it's when you comment on it that you fall in danger of libel. You leave it to the reader to make their minds up. And normally speaking, certainly in the stories in Private Eye, the facts are so dreadful that they jump out at you. But you don't comment, or you're very careful with your comment, because those are the very things that can get you into trouble. And your lawyers will tell you that. Which brings me on to the third point, is that, like it or not, you need good lawyers. Lawyers rule the world, unfortunately, certainly in America and to a large extent in this country. And whether we like it or not, which we don't, the English libel laws are probably amongst the most restrictive in the Western world, certainly. Why do you think so many Russian oligarchs to this day bring cases against fellow Russian oligarchs in England? Complete nonsense. Boris Berezovsky, an enemy of Putin, who fled to this country, sued Roman Abramovich, a friend of Putin's, or erstwhile friend, for a huge sum of money in the English High Court. The case took 6 months. 6 months of the most expensive lawyers possibly in the world, certainly in England, racking up costs which, when after the final judgment, were estimated at £100 million. £100 million. Why do they come to England? Because, rightly or wrongly, English courts have a very high reputation throughout the world. Financial and company law in the Cayman Islands, in the British Virgin Islands, and in all British territories are subject to British law. So British lawyers make a fat fortune by flying out to those dependencies and representing their clients there. And the result was a total disaster for Berezovsky, the man who had sued. Why? Because Boris was a great sort of bluff, loud, I can do anything type. And he opted to speak in Russian. The quiet, reclusive Abramovich, who could speak English just as well as Berezovsky, asked for an interpreter. Now, I don't know how many of you have attended high court proceedings. They are very long and very boring, but they can be fascinating. And one of the fascinating things is watching at the prosecution or a defending QC or KC interrogating a witness when they have the guy or the woman on the run. So they speed up their question. Come, and they do that. Impossible if you have to go via a translator. Because first of all, you make the allegation in English, which is then translated into Russian for Abramovich, who therefore has an extra 30, 45 seconds to think of his answer. He then replies in Russian, which is then translated into English, by which time it's a bit, I don't know how many of you watch football, but it's like what people do. One side will try and speed the game up. It's in their interest to speed it up. The other side will slow it down. And that's what Abramovich managed to do. The second problem for Berezovsky was that he had already tried some of these allegations in courts in Israel, in America, all over the world. And being Boris, he forgot what he said in some of those trials. Abramovich, hiring the very best lawyers around, was able to spend a fortune getting hold of all his legal documents. And at the end of the day, the lady judge gave her judgment, which was dynamite. It absolutely destroyed Berezovsky. It said he was not a man whose word could be trusted, etc., etc., etc. So he had costs, and costs were given against him. So that's £100 million he had to find. Worst of all, he had a long list of other potential court cases that he was going to bring had he won. His lawyers would have said to him, Boris, you can't, because all the other side will need to do is to quote this judgment from the lady. So he's totally destroyed. Several months later, he either committed suicide or was murdered. It's impossible to tell. He slit his wrists. My own view is that he probably committed suicide. I have no love for the Russian secret services, but in a sense, they didn't need to, because he was a lost man by then.
7 minutes.
Right. I can't remember how many that is, but I have been talking quite a long time. What we suggest happens now is that if any of you have any questions...
I think there's one more thing you wanted to talk about, Martin, which was niche expertise, or the need to develop a niche.
Ah, yes. Yeah. So I was going to finish up with that. Well, I'll do that now. Now, as you progress, hopefully, well, there's a couple of points. One is that journalism is now very, very different from in my day, because in my day, it was all about getting your story out by such and such a time to meet the print deadline. And there were sometimes 2, sometimes 3 editions of the same newspaper. So, unfortunately, nowadays, the minute you put the first story out, it goes all around the world on the web. And any exclusivity is lost. So the newspaper doesn't really gain necessarily the credit for having broken that story, because even though you'd spent money developing and whatever, and certainly worse with AI, it can be borrowed, whatever, you know, all over the world. And so that is a bit of a problem. But the issues remain the same. We'll always be suspicious of authority and power. That's what we're there for. I mean, in the blurb for my talk there, I quote George Orwell, who said basically, journalism is about printing something that somebody or some people don't want you to. Otherwise, it's PR. And that's true. You are going to upset people. If you don't like upsetting people, don't become an investigative journalist. The rationale for it is that we are a separate estate, as it were, the fifth estate, holding the feet of authority to the fire. One other thing that hasn't changed is, in order to progress in your career, it's quite important to develop a niche of some sort. Because there are a lot of journalists, and the problem with most of us as journalists is we know a little bit about an awful lot, because you have to cover a dozen things in a week. It's much better, and it's not always possible, if you can develop a deep knowledge of a particular subject. For example, in my case, I made a virtue out of a necessity in a way. I spent the best part of 10 years in Soho, which in those days was effectively a village where everybody knew everybody else, and it had probably the highest concentration of pubs and bars and clubs in Britain. And I was able to gain a knowledge of what was really happening in Soho with the pornography trade, with the various criminal activities, which the police envied, and they would actually cooperate and come and see me and ask me what I knew about such and such a thing. So I was able to write a book about it. I was on television quite a lot about it, and to this day, I still am asked about Soho. But the other more permanent thing was to study and work out how Companies House worked, what you needed to know, some of the shortcuts you could use, some of the difficulties with it, and you would be surprised, and I was shocked, how few Fleet Street journalists knew anything about accounts. Now, we live in a capitalist society, like it or not. At the heart of capitalism is the humble firm. It might be Facebook, it might be something like that, it might be X, it might be Twitter, but it always boils down, it might be Microsoft, it always boils down to a company. And if you can find out from the figures the actual facts, then that is your starting point for your analysis of whatever. But it needn't be that. It could be anything. It could be some aspect of climate change. It could be forestry. But once you become the, as it were, the go-to person, then as a freelance, because a freelance life is quite difficult, there's no certainty that you'll be working next month. And then it all comes in a rush. You have to learn to live with that. It's a little bit feast and famine. But increasingly, I think people will be freelancers, because the number of jobs, certainly in the mainstream press, is daily decreasing. because if AI can do it, why bother to pay somebody wages? Somebody who might be ill, somebody who might go away and have a baby, somebody who might, much easier to rely on these wonderful machines. So, I mean, to me, that is a huge threat to investigative journalism. But we started CIJ in 2003, when it looked as if investigative journalism was pretty well on its last legs. That was an exaggeration, but only just. The numbers attending our summer school have remained steady over the years. We are limited in number by health and safety issues. Our outreach, if you like, has suddenly blossomed all over the world. And we are very proud of our achievements in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, because these are the countries where good journalism is vital, absolutely vital. And all I can say to you is that you won't make a huge amount of money. You will be doing God's work. I say that as a card-carrying atheist. And if I'm wrong, I'll come back and tell you. But we are doing, as I say, God's work. And you occasionally hit the jackpot. Not financially, but somebody you've been chasing for a number of years and you know is corrupt and you know is evil. I'll use that word, gets their comeuppance. It doesn't happen all that many times, but it does happen. And I think the last words I would actually say to you before we get into the question are, enjoy yourselves, because there's a lot of fun. There's a lot of hard work, there's a lot of grey matter goes into it, but it is well worth doing. And at the end of the day, you can sleep content that you're on the side of good and against that of evil. Okay, now what I said is go on, sorry.
Thank you, Martin. I do hope it still is fun for those young people who are doing it. I'm afraid we're out of time, actually, because the next talk is starting. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Martin Tomkinson, one of the finest and most pugnacious journalists around. Thanks, Martin.